Hi everyone. In today's video, you're dropped straight into a high-level second year IPSA professional training seminar taught by Steve and Pauline Richards. Frequent viewers of Jung To Live By and our professional students, past and present, will understand that affect, or emotion, is the carrier wave of instinct, and in turn, instinct carries the intentionality of the genome to act in the world, and through teleology, guide someone towards becoming themselves. That much is clear from the clinical empiricism of Steve and Pauline, and further informed and supported by the insights from, among others, the emerging field of neuropsychoanalysis and the work of Professor Eric Goodwin. However, this natural unfolding of potential across the lifespan is often interrupted and distorted by the formation and action of complexes. As such, the stage is set for much of the work of authentic personal development, engaging with instinct through affect to disidentify with complexes and release one's full potential. In this clip, Steve and Pauline discuss, among many things, how complexes initially take hold in the psychobiology of an individual, and how much of the work of the ego is to learn how to interpret signals from the unconscious, such as anxiety, appropriately, in order to move forward towards a healthier and better adapted future. The use of both hypnosis and the creation of counter-complexes in order to do this is also discussed. There is a huge amount in this video, and we really hope that you gain a lot from it. Let's go.
In the context of what we discussed yesterday on Sunday, it was so heavy and densely laden. But one of them had to do with the issue of polarities, opposites, which you get in common in cognitive therapy and in Jungian thinking as well. People think that they're very different to one another, but fundamentally they have that in common, that they are interested in the opposites, as the Jungians call them. And that is a fundamentally neurotic position. And the argument was made yesterday and on Sunday that it makes no biological sense for a system to be that polarized or to be set in a position where it oscillates between extremes. We're supposed to have an adaptive bandwidth. And that when people come into us and they are in a state of division, which is the definition of a neurosis, the last thing we should do is to overlay that with the suggestion of more division. And a lot was discussed about that, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And how not to do it clinically. So yeah, that's an important point, James. And what you said earlier too, I think is a really important one going forward, which is the role of the self-concept, the dream ego and the waking ego to one another and their complexes, the associated complexes, and how our identity shifts between the two when we move into a dream state and back into a waking state. And how we can use that therapeutically as well to help people. But when you interpret that natural phenomenon, say through a Jungian lens, you start immediately to acquire nonsense that shouldn't be there in our view, which just clouds the issue and doesn't help a person get to grips with things at all.
Yeah.
So again, that kind of thing was discussed, and it's at those levels you guys will be operating at this year. So need to understand theory, but not in an abstract sense. It has to be applied in a living sense, directly to working with people and working with ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think James's point too on the idea of not taking a position or a stand on something is a very important one, really, because in a way, when somebody comes in to see you clinically for therapy, they want you to advocate for the better part of them. And you know, for us, obviously that is the genome, the genomic self. And you were talking yesterday about, I think you used sort of the analogy, the metaphor of the periscope.
Oh yeah.
Which is quite an entertaining one.
Yeah.
You know, sort of, and it's like that with complexes. You know, when you're working with someone, they do line up ready to fire at you.
They do.
And you do have to be prepared for them.
Yeah.
And part of taking a position on something really is it's a way of being actively engaged in that process. And if you don't do that, then you know you're going to just allow complexes to run amok, and you're going to confirm them as opposed to challenging them. Yeah. And it just means that the therapy will go nowhere. You know, you might as well just be a Rogerian counsellor giving unconditional positive regard to the complexes. We did discuss that.
Yes, yeah. Yesterday we put a scenario in where, for example, you have a counselling skills, Rogerian counselling level of working with someone, which, you know, within certain contexts is fine. Then a depth psychology approach, and then a hypnotherapy approach. Yeah. And where they all sit together. And I know I keep saying this, but when you listen and watch that and allow that to sink in and unpack, you're going to get an awful lot you won't normally get on any of these courses, because it's the distillation of experience over 42 years now of working with real people. So that's important, because it's an awful place out there, the psychotherapy world. It's full of abstract ideas about human nature, but the most important thing is being able to see things as they really are. And that's the biggest impediment, because theory gets in the way of the experience of the other. And we're using the metaphor of a collapsed waveform to describe how things are pulled into focus and then exclude everything else. And it is a metaphor, or at least an analogy from quantum physics, where they talk about the probability of something happening or not happening, and then you make an observation and you see something, and because you've observed it in a certain way, what you have seen happens, but that's caused by us observing it. That happens with psychological theories as well. So if we collapse into a Jungian waveform, we will see certain things which are determined by the method of our observation, and they exclude other things. There are all sorts of collapsed waveforms out there. For example, if we collapse into biology, so to speak, and we look at a phenomenon biologically, we won't see much of psychology. We can't, because we've made it a biological issue. We do not see the psychology. It's the same with psychology. If we collapse the human being into only being psychology, we do not understand the biology. We don't understand their social relationships, don't understand the interaction with the natural environment. So whatever model we choose is a collapsed waveform. We collapse into it. Complexes collapses. They want us to justify them. We become collapsed by them into their rhetoric and into their understanding, their model of the world, and then we don't see other things and we're trapped. But that's true of psychological theories as well. The power of that biopsychosocial model, and as I say, the last two sessions we go through it really intensely, is that it allows you not to stay in one collapsed state, but to move between them, to open that up, and then to shrink it again once you've made the appropriate assessment of a situation. So that's at the psychological level, the theoretical level. When it comes to clinical work, all of your observations, all of them can potentially be collapses if we're not careful, and we won't see what's there. So if we're armed with Myers-Briggs Jungian typology, that's all we'll see. And we won't see anything else at all. And we'll insist that it's there in the other person, even if it's not. And other things that we were talking about yesterday and on Sunday was how psychological infection occurs, the actual mechanics of how this occurs, how we can infect other people, how that works through transference and projection and all the rest of it. And in other words, how to make yourself as hygienic as possible and open as possible. So they were really intense sessions, and well worth looking at. Although Carter 1 are well into year 2 now, I really think you guys could do with grasping at that now before you start to pick up on the other stuff. And as I say, we'll be filming new material for you, so you will in effect be learning ahead of where Carter 1 is at. And I'll be asking Carder 1 to look at your material to bring them up to date. So we'll be increasing the bandwidth of skills and knowledge as you go along. The past 2 sessions and the ones that I'm asking you guys to have a look at, I'm sorry it'll be about 6 hours, but there is a lot in those 6 hours. There's probably 20 hours worth of material compressed into 6 hours. One of the things that's coming out is the importance of instincts and how that they are generally misunderstood, what they are. And that if you can get down to that level, you can solve most things very, very quickly. And again, this has gone through in a practical as well as a theoretical way, but that has to be, we feel, the approach if you're going to get people right. The OCD example that was mentioned, bang on, because you will always find that the fantasies which are hidden behind the anxiety have to do with something instinctive.
Yes.
That, if you like, is the persona of the actual core of the problem. That's where the conflict is. It's at an instinctive level. If you try to be hyper rational about that and not accept it on its own terms, you're not going to get a result very easily, or if you do, it'll be superficial, and the instinctive pressure will build up and we'll have a relapse. But the minute you get into an instinctive communication, you get a relaxation, not a relapse, but a relaxation in a person, and things start to change in them, which they can feel. And again, there's this compulsive nature in a positive sense with respect to feeling that it validates the state that we are in. It feels right. Whereas if we think right, it might not change. But if we feel right, it automatically changes. Just as if something feels wrong, then we have a reaction to that, and it's very, very hard to shift it. So we need to get down to the level where instincts are communicating. And if instincts are in conflict, which can happen because of the state of the ego's adaptations to the world, then we have to get down there and start to negotiate with that which regulates the whole personality, so that some instinctive pressure is relaxed and some is amplified to help a person adapt in the world, because downstream of the immediate moment, all of the instincts can be satisfied. And very often that's all the psyche needs to hear, is that the ego's adaptation downstream will adapt sufficiently, and then it'll ease off. But the minute the ego gets hold of the conflict and then starts to interpret that conflict in a way which undermines it, and of course the obvious way that this happens is that symptoms are very, very unpleasant. So there's a signal, and the signal is misunderstood, is misinterpreted. This is unpleasant. I have to repress it. I have to push it away. As you guys know, I'm sure, at that point, then you have a division in consciousness where the ego basically, first of all, suppresses, not represses, but suppresses. But then it divides, it splits. And the ego basically says to a part of itself that's sectioned off, you go and deal with that. I don't want to think or feel about this. I don't want to know. And obligingly, the split off part does go away under instructions that the ego doesn't want to know. Okay, what I'll do is I'll stop you from knowing, and I'll behave autonomously outside of your control to obey the instructions that I was set up to do, which is to stop you from feeling things. So what will I do? How do I do that? So in effect, this complex, which is what it is, looks back, this is metaphor, of course, looks back and sees the instinctive pressure coming towards ego consciousness, and it stands in the way and it caps it, and then it interprets it and redirects it. So the ego at this point now is in a state of repression because it has forgotten. It doesn't know that it's split. It doesn't remember the trauma, doesn't remember the anxiety or whatever the situation was that generated that split. So we have an autonomous complex which caps instinct and redirects energy and libido away from ego consciousness. The ego does not feel the distress that it should feel in the form of a signal. The signal was misread as being innately and fundamentally by its nature unpleasant and harmful, without the ego understanding that the unconscious is not ego consciousness. It communicates in the way that it does because it's the only way that it can. And when someone knows that, when someone has the ego strength to know that this unpleasant feeling will switch instantly that you receive it, and not fight it, but receive it as a signal, and you do something very paradoxical and say, thank you for sending me that state of anxiety. I'd like to understand what it is that I need to do in order to correct for that. So you don't need to send me that signal anymore. That's a position of ego strength. Whereas, oh God, I don't want to hear this, don't want to think it, feel it, no, go away, is not ego strength. That's maladaptive. The response from a homeostatic, that is to say a self-regulating system, to an ego or an element of a system like that does that is to push harder. So the anxiety increases. And of course the ego says, you deal with it, split off, you go and deal with that, thank you, I don't want to know. And the complex says, okay, fine, thank you. And then later, when the ego becomes aware it's done it through a rationalistic approach, it tries to stop the complex from functioning. The complex says, I'm sorry, I know better than you. Remember what you told me? You told me to deal with this because you couldn't cope. I've taken over responsibility for dealing with this. The complex, in effect, is saying functionally to the ego, therefore, I will deal with this and you will not be able to stop me because you set me up to not be stopped. And that's how it is, or it appears to be, to the ego that starts to panic when it first gets that insight into itself and what it's done. And if we use a rationalistic approach, that's the first thing a person feels when they approach a complex, or the fact that they have divided or split under some kind of pressure, is to feel another kind of anxiety about that, which makes the whole thing feel worse. Hypnosis in its various forms, not just the formal induction of hypnosis, but utilizing other kinds of altered states of consciousness, say through creative media, creative therapies, the use of imagery in different ways from formal hypnosis, sand trays, enactments, all these things that you're going to be learning about creative writing. All of that helps to alter consciousness in the sense that the ego's perception of what it's doing to itself changes, and the signal is transformed from being anxiety or wherever it might be into something else, which the ego can then reassimilate. All of that, because it involves altered states of consciousness, is rooted in the basics of hypnosis, even if you're using creative therapies. That's really important to understand, and it's one of the reasons why we push hypnosis as being the core skill for any depth psychologist and psychotherapist, is that if you can work with altered states of consciousness and access the unconscious and the psychobiological regulation of the system as a whole, you can do pretty much anything with that. So it's extremely powerful. So yeah, so most people, when they feel anxiety, they want it to go away. And then we have this kind of superficial approach. First of all, you get with therapists, typically. Level one is counseling. That's just the accepting of the other person and being a sounding board and listening and reflecting things back, giving unconditional positive regard, which by the way is impossible, but you're supposed to give that. And then empathy and genuineness and warmth. These are all valuable psychosocial things. We feel good when somebody gives us those counseling core conditions, because we've evolved to be psychosocial. That means we've evolved to engage with people and have a hormonal release in our bodies that makes us feel good, but it's temporary and it doesn't shift the underlying problem. That's counseling. It's on the surface. Now, as we go down a little deeper, we're going into something that's more pragmatic and focused, like cognitive therapy. The cognitive and behavioral therapy, which of course are now conjoined, they used to be separate kinds of approach, are interested in a mechanistic approach, which is brief and focal and basically just wants the person to stop doing the wrong thing and to shut out feelings and to work on whether you're being rational or not. Now that is a form of suggestion, obviously, and suggestion is the delivery mechanism for influence. What is influence? Influence is the exchange of energy and information between systems, whether they're systems in the body, whether they're psychological or psychosocial systems. It's the moving round of energy and information, and the moving round of it will involve the acceptance of it from another system. That's influence, that's suggestion, that's CBT. That's what it's trying to do. But it does so without providing the conditions which will facilitate it being more effective, which is a trance state. Why is a trance state more effective? Rossi answered this in the personal myth guide, right at the beginning. Pretty much there's a watermarked image of him in the background, And there's a quote from him, and he says, "Hypnosis used to be a mystery. We didn't know how it worked, but now we do." And what he says is, it's about mind and molecule. It's connecting the two. And CBT therapists have no model of biology, none. They're psychologically reductive, psychoreductive for short. So when they try to work with the complexity of the human system, they can only work in a psychologically reductive way. They use influence, or they attempt to, but without that state which facilitates influence to work. Even counselors get a little bit of that right, because they try and get people to feel good about receiving warmth, congruence, empathy, and so forth. But they do nothing with the state. CBT therapists don't create the state. They bring in a missing bit for the counselors. But both of them are missing the thing that will make it work, which is a deep understanding of the connection between mind and body, and the hormonal psychoneuroendocrine states, for example, that are necessary to facilitate that. Now we get down to the level of the Jungians. And the Jungians have an incredible way of making people attached to them. They elevate themselves in terms of status. They talk about how important their model is, and how a patient has to come in and analyze their dreams and talk about all these strange, weird and wonderful ideas. And people who are in distress are looking for that kind of thing. They want an apex level therapist, and Jungians suggest that they are to people. But they go in, and then they're told at some point you're going to have to work through the transference, and we'll get into a process called alchemy, where you will change and I, the therapist, will change, and we will change together, and all these wonderful things will happen. But it will take time, and you have to come in 2-3 times a week for perhaps 4 years before we'll get there. And if you don't feel that's for you, don't bother. I'm sorry, you'll have to go and get counselling or something like that. So again, the Jungians go off, forgive the expression, half-cocked on that one. Because hypnosis can do everything those three can do that I've mentioned and more, and do it quickly. They induce a state of change within which the brain, the body, the mind, the psyche, and psychosocial relationships can all be optimized for change quickly. They can do it by removing resistance, the thing that gets in the way of the psychoanalysts and the Jungians. They can do it by bypassing polarity, which is the thing that the cognitive therapists generate. They say, this is good and that's bad, that's positive, that's negative, get rid of negative. We can bypass that. We do not need the collision between opposites like that generates further stress and anxiety. We can do what the Jungians do, but quickly. They say there is this thing called the self archetype, and it takes forever to get there, and you must do all these other things to get there. Whereas a really good hypnotist, hypnotherapist will get there without even using the concept of the self archetype, because he or she will go to the genome, which is the foundation of the personality and of our physical structure and our psychological structure, and will facilitate positive therapeutic change from the genome, which is in effect the, as I say, Jung's self archetype. But Jung's self archetype is collapsed into psychology. There's no understanding of biology at all. So hypnotherapists generate, the good ones, the conditions under which change can occur rapidly and quickly, and in ways that Rogerian therapists don't believe it's possible. Cognitive therapists don't believe it's possible. Jungians certainly don't believe it's possible, but you can do it quickly. And you can bring about those alchemical changes in people by communicating directly with the unconscious, right down into the materiality of their body and into the genome really, really fast. So that's why I believe, and I know Pauline backs me up on this, has the same view, that the hypnosis is the core skill. Psychotherapy, as you guys know, has 2 legitimate parents: medicine and hypnosis. Without a knowledge of medicine, there is no knowledge of the body. You don't have to be doctors, but you need to know about how it works, and you need to know about how so-called mind at the level of psychology interacts with so-called body, and how the two of them interact with the environment as a continuum. You need a model that's capable of doing that, and you need a therapeutic model that is effective enough to work at any level and to create change. That's why hypnosis is super powerful. Also, because it's the parent of psychotherapy, in terms of psychological work, it's the distillation of medicine and of itself as applied to a psychological therapy. It means that you can apply hypnotherapeutic methods, techniques, and so forth to any depth psychological method that you would use. That again makes it far more powerful.
We were asked yesterday about counter complexes too, Steve, weren't we? That was another area we discussed. And just following on from what you were saying, if you take a purely CBT position on that, then you would probably have to say that it would if you were trying to create a counter complex as a CBT therapist, that it would basically be some kind of positive cognitive construct.
Yeah, it would.
And you can see the limitations in that.
Yeah.
Whereas, as you say, if you take a psychobiological perspective, and when we know that complexes, for example, are psychobiological and psychosocial as well.
Yeah. Biopsychosocial in effect. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. You could see how much more profound it would be to create that kind of counter complex in someone, and more complete and more extensive in terms of their ability to correct for whatever was wrong for them, than if you just collapse down into a CBT framework and you just try and get people to change their ideation. You can see how one is going to be much more successful than the other. It's so much more powerful for a start to make those changes across the board, across so many different systems.
Yes, indeed. And it does go back to what we were saying just before about instincts. You know, instincts are released from the genome. They have a teleology. In other words, there's a goal in an instinct that it wants to be fulfilled, and it's always downstream, the goal. It's triggered in the moment, but there's something in the future that it's aimed at. And of course, the general category of self-preservation, the instinct of self-preservation, it includes the idea that we'll be optimally adapted. So the whole of our organism is tuned to being the best that we can be with the minimum distress. So that's what we should go for. If we only go for rationalism, we're going to cause problems, and it'll be superficial and it won't work.